Welcome everybody to this session. It's entitled Comparing to Improve, and it's all about benchmarking data and the way in which we can harness those, in particular to look at how business models could, might, should change. My name is Sarah Thelwall and I am based in London, and I run a company called MyCake, and our specialism is harnessing financial data in the cultural sector to do exactly that job, to look at how business model change, to look at what normal is, what best is, what good is, what where the potential is for the future. You have probably had some of this information already, but I shall give it again anyway. There is an invitation to join the conversation on social media using the hashtag #DataEchoCulture. We have a live transcriber for the session, and you can select your language down the bottom under interpretation. This session is being recorded, so if you don't wish to be appearing in the recording, please keep your camera off. I have two presentations to give. Catherine is going to do the moderation. Once I go into presentation mode, I won't be able to see the chat. So she is either going to shout out to me and say, "Oi, there's a question," or she's going to ask you to keep it to the end, one or the other, her call. My suggestion is that all kind of immediate questions about clarification or what does that mean, or can you tell me this bit, because otherwise the rest of it won't make sense. Catherine will jump in with those when they happen. And then the more sort of discursive stuff, I suggest we keep until slightly later on. I will probably have a sort of how are we doing, where are we at, between the sort of end of the first part, which is the sort of theory of things, and then the second part that is some examples that use some real data on some UK organisations. So without further ado, I am going to share that one. Okay. So the premise here is that comparative data is about looking at where you sit in a marketplace, and I mean that in the broadest sense of things, to help you evaluate past performance in the context of other people like you, and to plan for future success. That's the kind of overall frame of it. In terms of what I'm going to cover, I'm going to look at, well, what is benchmarking? What do we mean by it? In what way is that powerful? What are the sorts of things you can compare? Where does this take us going on into the future? And some stuff around confidentiality and how we do this in a manner which is secure, confidential, doesn't break the sort of commercial sensitivity around some of this data. So to ensure that we're all on the same page, a definition to get us started, I'm taking benchmarking as being a mechanism by which we measure the quality of an organization's policies or strategies, or and how you do that with using a standardized set of measurements, or some sense of how you create similarity between you and your peers. We are familiar with benchmarks, they're around us all the time. Here is an example of a benchmark of which countries won the most Olympic medals. So it's making a set of comparisons between some standardized measures. Let's make that a little more relevant to our situation in culture. The way that I'm looking at this is to say, how do we work out where improvement is possible, preferable, worth the effort? One of the ways in which we can do that is to say, well, how are other organizations achieving their performance? How do the best in class at, I don't know, running the best cafe or having the most successful youth program, how do they do that? Because if we can work out what best in class looks like, then the ability to say, well, what does it take to get there? How much effort is required? How big a change is that for us? And will it deliver a return on investment that's worth having? Because if you're already best in class at, I don't know, achieving donations, and the marginal opportunity for improvement is so small versus what you'd have to spend to get there, you might well say, well, that's just not worth the effort. So it's also about putting effort in the most useful places. So making choices between the use of limited resources. You can't spend, there's not an endless pot of money to spend on getting better. So how do we make those choices about what's worth the effort? I split sort of examples of areas where benchmarking has benefits into 3 or 4 things. Let's start with the internal ones. The first place I use it is to say, well, where is your organization strong versus a peer group? So, one example of this would be you could be a 400-seat theatre in a town, and you're thinking of how do you make your cafe and your bar area run better? So if we could find another 3, 5, 10, roughly 400-seat theatres that also had cafes, we could ask ourselves, what's the difference between what you're doing and what they're doing, and where's the opportunity for improvement? I often, because my job is around doing this, around business model change as opposed to audience work, then quite often what we're doing is saying, how do we either diversify income or manage cost? So this might be something you're doing already. You might already have, I can keep using the cafe example till you get bored of it. You might already have a cafe, in which case you have a sense of what is and isn't working for you. But if you've never run a cafe before, how do you know what it might be worth to you? And is it worth the effort to go there? If you're seeking to diversify your income into from one-off donations into regular donations, what does success look like, and is it worth the effort to do it? And what this is really driving at is to say, if you think about how you set budgets and targets for the next financial year, to what extent at the moment are you saying, well, COVID accepted, it's like last year plus a bit minus a bit? It's saying, we're going to carry on doing what we're doing, so it'll be broadly similar. We might like to, have a bit more income from it, or we might see if we can make it a bit more cost efficient, but essentially it's like last year. So that's all very well and good, but what happened? How do you know whether what you're doing is good, bad, or ugly if you're not making a set of comparisons? So if you've improved your turnover by 10%, you might well look at that and go, fantastic, well done us. But if it were the case that the whole of the rest of the market has on the whole improved by 20%, you might view that a little differently. But you wouldn't know it if you weren't making those comparisons. So internal goal setting and the ability to look at other people like you and saying, what can we learn from that for our purposes, is the place I tend to start. If we sort of broaden that out a little and say, well, what's the next layer of things? I think there's a layer of this that says, how do we talk to, whether it's stakeholders, customers, funders, government, to say, how do I demonstrate that what we're doing is either great and you should continue funding us, or we've got something we need to improve at and please will you help us? So the ability to have data-backed and evidence-backed funding applications that say that the norm is X, we're not there yet, can we have some help getting there? Or we are already best at and we want to become better, can you help us with this bit? So, or we're great at, by comparison to the rest of the sector, this is why you fund us, aren't we doing a good job? So all of that, I think, has a number of uses. I think it can contribute to things like your funding applications. I think it's great for galvanizing your volunteers and your members, and a way of communicating your achievements in, evidence-backed terms. Obviously, there's lots of the work that we do here that isn't about the numbers, the money, the finance, the etc. But being able to say we are resilient, we are getting through these tough times, we need your help in this specific place to help us get through it. The ability to hone that message and sharpen it, in some cases, is aided by this kind of comparative data. Catherine, how am I doing? Any questions so far?
You're doing fabulously.
Thank you, darling. So moving again in a sort of wider circle again, other areas where benchmarking has benefits. If you're running some form of trade body, sector support organisation, professional membership organization, then being able to aggregate this kind of data across a sector or across a place to say, we can see strengths here, weaknesses there, here's a place where support or development is needed. So the ability to start with that data at the level of a single organization and aggregate it up, both to look at a sector or perhaps to look at trends over time, I think it has use in both of those areas. So one of the things that I'll be referring to later on is some of our work that takes Arts Council England data and looks at trends in the relationship between grant income and earned income and how it's changing over time, as a marker of just the balance of a business model. And then at the sort of fourth layer of this, then I think there's a job, and this is one that we do when we're working with central government, is we're looking at how you aggregate all of that data up so that we look at the whole of, in our case, we're looking at the non-profit cultural sector as a whole. And so that could be things like contribution to gross domestic product, or indeed GVA. That could be done, by the way, both at local authority, so local government level, and regional and national government level. But it could also be about how we lobby to the Treasury for content of a budget at a national level from the Department of Culture. So the lobbying for the sector as a whole, and the setting of policy. We've got some interesting work on at the moment where we're looking at how you would improve data flows to enable the kind of econometric modelling of a sector to say, well, where is support required? And that's going on to look at, well, where is the risk as well? How do we look at risk and resilience in this sector? So using historic data to forecast future need. That's the kind of cutting edge of the stuff that is live for us at the moment. So coming back to the sort of more immediate, the pragmatic, what are the sorts of benefits that you might reasonably expect to accrue if you were to go down this path? I think the ability, as I say, to shift the way you set goals from, like last year, plus minus a bit, to what does best in class look like? What does it take to get there? So I think that kind of shift in mindset for me is quite a substantial one. The second piece is about what happens when an organization grows over the medium to long term, because business models are not the same for an organization that's below a couple of $100,000 versus one that's over, say, a couple of $1 million. The structure of those business models, the way that you employ people, the difference perhaps between project funding and core funding. So a small organization is not a mini-me version of a big one. And organizations that run buildings, particularly publicly accessible buildings, are not the same as touring entities. I mean, this is blatantly obvious, but financially they're structured really differently. So if let's imagine you have been non-building based for the last 10 years and you're thinking, isn't it about time that we had a building to do X, Y, Z in? The experience you've had in your past business model is not necessarily going to set you up for the business model you're going to need to run a building. And therefore, going and learning how organizations that do run a building have gone about that shift might have quite a bit to teach you. And other examples of this would be when an organization that, let's say, has a building, is doing a major refurbishment, adding some new spaces, changing the layout. Again, there's a lot of finger in the air. What might the future look like? And even now, I would say it is relatively uncommon to say, right, let's go and look at 20 organizations of the scale that we want to be after the refurb and see how they do it. And yet that data is absolutely available. It could be done, but it is still moderately uncommon. I mean, it's not uncommon for me, I do it all the time, but broadly across the sector, that's still not commonplace. And all of this really is about saying, how do we understand what best in class looks like? And how do we understand that in financial terms, as well as understanding it in terms of fabulous cultural creative content? So it's a parallel discussion, because if we can't sort the finances out, we haven't got the robust and resilient base to support that innovation in the cultural content production. I am sure I'm sounding very dry, but...
May I sneak a question of my own in, Sarah?
Go on then.
What other large changes in terms of how a business operates? So you've mentioned capital changes. What other changes do you think would prompt, this is a really good time to be looking at some comparators and getting some deeper information?
Yeah. So yes, one of the things that fundamentally affects the structure of a business model is the extent to which you're running a public building or not. Really big difference between those two. One of the things that we've seen in the UK in the last 10 years is a reduction in local government funding. So through austerity budgeting, 70% of the monies that have come from national government to local government have disappeared in the last decade. So what that means is the kind of regular core funding that was you could use the money for anything you needed it for. It wasn't project specific. Chunks of that money have disappeared, and it has tended to result in a greater reliance upon project-based funding as the alternative when we're talking about grant funding types. And the difficulty with that is you can't use the money in the same ways because it'll be restricted income in the UK at least. And therefore your freedom to operate feels really different. And you risk the kind of roller coaster of got a project, haven't got a project, got a project, haven't got a project. So it's harder to maintain a core if all the money is attached to the delivery. And the funding of core costs is something that quite a lot of project funders don't enjoy seeing in a budget. It's entirely necessary, but it also tends to get squeezed. So I don't know, again, I can't tell you what it's like specifically in Canada, but in the UK, if you were to put more than 7 to 10% overhead into a funding bid, probably wouldn't go down very well. Realistically, what does it cost to run an organisation? 15 to 25% of turnover on overheads, much more realistic. So what that means is people are scrabbling around for as many projects as they can to hope that overall they get enough of their overheads covered. And that's hard. Have I answered the question? Yes. So that's about business model change and how do you do things that you haven't done before? And how do you, because if you haven't got the experience, haven't had the experience of doing it, how do you forecast that you might have these challenges? That one is, of course, nobody's favourite to talk about when it comes to going down rather than up in terms of turnover.
Well, yes.
But hey, so coming back to the kind of what are the sorts of benefits that accrue to people, then we've talked about the sort of understanding what best in class looks like. I think also the kind of a succinct summary, an honest reflection of your weaknesses and risks. So I don't know what it's like for you, but I think that there are times when I see that people are bidding for grant funding and they're putting, to use the colloquialism, a best foot forward. They're saying, aren't we wonderful? We're doing these amazing things. Wouldn't you like to fund us? And the opportunity to have a discussion about these are our weaknesses, these are our risks, this bit feels problematic. There aren't that many places where you would honestly air that kind of dirty washing, and yet it's the stuff that needs addressing. Now, hopefully you're addressing that in trustee meetings with governance, etc. But do I believe it happens as often as it should do? Not convinced. Forgive me for my cynicism on that matter. But I do think there's something in here that's about visibility with and respect from funders, whether that's about the honesty of we need X, or this is at risk, or we want to get better at this, as well as we are greater at. I for me, that balanced message, I think, has utility. Feel free to wildly disagree with me if that sounds far too optimistic. And then, my last point in a similar vein is to say that I think this is about the role as leaders to say, how do we make a use of all the resources that are available to us, particularly in these difficult climates? How do we make sure that we've looked at all our opportunities, looked at all the possibilities? Because also there are times when, whether it's a trustee, whether it's somebody from the funder, will go, don't you think you ought to do X? I think it'd be great if you considered. And sometimes those, you'll get some good ideas out of that, but sometimes you'll get completely duff ideas where the return on investment will be lousy. So the ability to say we've looked at that and we're either already great at it, or the marginal improvement is only X and it would cost us a fortune to get there. The ability to choose to actively not do something, I think, is also really valuable. And so weighing up the opportunities and costs is one of the things that this is good for. So, and again, this is where the question is, how different is this in Canada to the UK? From a UK perspective, I would say that excellent data already exists, which can be used for these purposes. I would say this, wouldn't I? I don't think it's being used as much as it could be. I think there are a proportion of people, not just in the cultural sector, but more broadly in the non-profit world, where the motivation to work in this sector is not about financial performance, it's about the quality of the cultural output. And sometimes that goes so far as to be somewhat allergic to some of the financial discussions. Again, feel free to disagree with me. I have a hobby horse of that subject. But let's ask the question about why not. So what are the reasons? When I propose this to somebody, what do I get back? That is people going, thanks, but no, goodbye. People will say that there's nobody like us. We are unique. You couldn't possibly compare anybody else's business model to us. Don't try. Another response is to say, well, the world isn't changing. I guess it's not a COVID response. The world isn't changing that much. We did all right last year. We'll probably do all right next year. Let's not worry about it. Where's the data? I don't know where to look for that. No, it can't possibly exist because I've never seen it. Fourth one is interesting. I don't, when you show me the national data, I don't see myself in it. So why would I look further? That doesn't feel like it's relevant. And the other one is, well, we know what we're doing. We're running a successful organization already. We're professional about this. What else could this possibly teach us? So there are a few of those. And one of my responses is to say, I bet you I can. You tell me what you think it is that's key about the way your organization works. I bet you I could put a comparison group together. That's the competitive person in me that says, I'm sure I can. The market hasn't changed much. Well, that's not the world we're living in right now. So I'm going to ditch that for the time being.
No.
The data piece is about saying, here, let me show you. If that's all it is, if that's the only problem, let me show you the data, no bother. The national data, I think, is a really interesting one, because if it all gets aggregated up, of course you're not going to see yourself in it. So we need to make that data available in formats where you can see it and it does feel relevant. So there is a job of work to do there. So partly I want to reduce the kind of wriggle room that says, no, please don't make me. And partly I want to say, let me make this really relevant, because then, then you'll want to do it. Again, optimism rules. So there's a few responses in that. If we think about what are the things that you could be benchmarking, we work specifically on a set of financial benchmarks, but there's a bunch of other stuff you could be looking at. It's just, you would never come to MyCake for them. So if we stick to the, I'm going to stick to the stuff I do know about. So what sorts of, let's get into a bit more detail here. What kinds of questions could you actually ask? What could we, if you picked up the phone afterwards and said, right, let's talk about this, what are the sorts of things that we might be looking at? So one of the really common ones in the UK is about what's the relationship of the balance between grant funding and trading. And that's because in the UK there's been a push for a decade and more to be less dependent on grant funding and to grow your trading activities. There's some really interesting COVID results of that I won't go into right now. Then there's things, well, what is a normal level of spend on the production of cultural content? One of my sort of data asides here is that we do this work not just in culture, we do it across the non-profit sector. It's really interesting to see the direct cost spend on culture. It's about 40% of turnover, with staffing being another 40%. So that one-to-one relationship between the people and the cultural content, you don't see that in other non-profit sectors. If I'm looking at a bunch of other kind of service provision areas, you'll see higher spend, similar to higher spend on staffing, but the direct cost, maybe 10%. So culture is definitely specific in the way that it spends on new content. Another way of thinking about this is to say, well, who do you aspire to be? Not just who do we compare you to your peers today, but what's the journey that you want to go on over the next 5 years? And related to that is, well, what does best in class look like? And how do we, things like what is fundraising success? So in some of the data that we could look at, the average is that for every pound or dollar spent going out and raising funds, you should expect to achieve somewhere around a 5 to 6 fold return. So £1 spent, £5 to £6 back, essentially. But the best in class, how good can it get? That really starts to get interesting as a discussion. I'm not a fundraising specialist, but I have friends and colleagues who know that really well. And there's, again, that, what does it take to go from good to great in there? Other things like, what difference does it matter what you're spending on marketing? Is it 1%? Is it 5%? And what difference is that making to your earned income levels? What proportion of your spend on salaries on your senior team versus everybody else? And what difference does it make? To what extent are you making some form of contribution to reserves, the rainy day fund? How does that work? In the UK, another of my sort of random, semi-random facts is to say that when we look at the data on all charities, in any 1 year, about a third make a loss. So there's got to be a cash flow roller coaster going on in that. There's got to be a funding pattern in there that needs looking at. And what level of working capital is healthy, reasonable, doable? These are the things that have become really pertinent in the last year. So there's some really specific things we can do. I'm just going to look ahead before I take us into the kind of, here's a practical example piece. Things that we're looking at in the UK. Would you believe we don't have, here is a list of all the cultural organisations. Really need to get to that. Because if we don't know what the whole of the sector looks like, we can't possibly do that kind of detailed econometric modelling. We can't do the kind of building representative samples. We know a lot about people who receive funding and so much less about those who don't. And yet their market dynamics are utterly different. So once we get to that, then we can segment the data by art form, size, deprivation decile, all sorts of things. Can we improve the data flows? A large chunk of our data is available in PDFs. This is a royal pain. So what are the data submission routes that mean you don't have to read PDFs and manually transcribe them? When I hear people in national agencies going, oh yes, we're working with Microsoft to transcribe PDFs, you're just like, no, collect it in a machine readable format. Better idea. These things allow us to look at the modelling of risk and resilience. There's some work that I was involved in with the Audience Agency a few years ago looking at resilience. And actually there's some fantastic work been done in Canada that was really important in that work as a reference point. And this takes us towards looking at what the kind of cost-benefit returns are for that level of government subsidy, so that we can argue, so that we can make a stronger case for the benefits in here. So I'm getting towards the end of the sort of first part of this. Catherine, we could stick a couple of links in the chat here, because we've got some sort of past work that you might or might not find useful. We've been benchmarking different business models around things like running a cafe in a non-profit, running a retail in a non-profit setting, what the value of room hire is, etc. So I am going to stop sharing for a minute and pick up the other presentation. How are we doing, Catherine? Any other questions that we should be taking at this point?
We currently have a very quiet crew, so if anyone does feel the need to ask any questions, they would be very welcome, and please feel free to pop them into chat. I've also given you all some resources if you leave this session with a thirst to look at all of the wonderful data Sarah is sharing and think about your comparators. Here you go. Here are some places to start.
Okay, so meanwhile, I'm going to take us into one example of this that we are. Oh, stick that into SlideShare. Right. Rearrange my screen a little. So this is one of the links that. Can we see that, Catherine? Is that working? Yeah,
I can indeed.
Marvelous! What a relief. So this is one of the links that Catherine has put up. We run a benchmark each year with an organisation called Cause 4 that comes out through the work of arts fundraising and philanthropy, which takes a nationally published data set and repurposes it. It takes the national portfolio organisation, so there's about 600 or 700 of those, and they have to report data to Arts Council England as their core funder each year, and that data is made available and on quite a granular basis, and therefore we can do things with it. I'm just keeping one eye on time. Doing all right. So what I thought I'd do is just take you through a few of the bits of this in the hope that that might either prompt some, wow, that's different to us, or what does that mean, or what's the equivalent in Canada, or stuff like that. So I realise that a bunch of UK data is not immediately relevant, but it is what I have to hand, and I'm hoping it will prompt discussion. So what I'm going to show you is a few of the pieces of the latest public release. There is an Excel dashboard that again is available alongside the report. All of this is freely available. You can have it if you'd like it. And there is data in here on these 3 years, so essentially from 15 through to 18, and it covers some 700 non-profit arts and culture organisations in England. I'll give you a rough overview of the sort of data structure so that we have can see where it's going to take us. So 3 years of data and the number of organisations who are reporting data of this type. We're going to split it between earned income as a total. So that could be things like ticket sales, workshops, it's the earned income from the main cultural activity of the organisation. The Arts Council line here is about the government subsidy that's coming through. There are several types of subsidy. In this case, it's all going to be aggregated up into one line. And then contributed income is things like private trusts and foundations, donations, sponsorship, other forms of philanthropy. And last but not least is things like local government subsidy. Anything else in there? Other forms of public subsidy. So we've got public grants sitting in there that aren't coming from the Arts Council. And I'm going to ignore these later lines because they talk about capital. Let's pretend they're not there. So the way that we're reporting this information is we're reporting what the average percentage of income is that's coming from each of these sources. And what we see is that earned income, ticket sales, etc., is actually not the top form of income, or not the largest bucket of income that these organisations are accruing. Actually, the combination of various types of Arts Council subsidy is the number one. Okay, the difference isn't huge. They're roughly 1 for 1. But I think it's interesting to see what that relationship is between grant and trading. And then either, depending on where you are, either that local authority money or perhaps the trusts and foundations, that one of those becomes the sort of third. So, and those are roughly evens in what they're worth. Not everybody gets them. So a lot of London-based organisations wouldn't receive any government subsidy from the local government, for example. So if that's a kind of rough national picture that says approximately what's the dynamic in here, when we start to slice that data, all sorts of interesting things start to appear. So here is a relationship between the earned income in blue and the Arts Council subsidy in orange, with the smallest organisations on the left and the largest organisations on the right. So we've taken those 650 odd organisations and we've stuck them into clusters according to their total annual turnover. I don't think it's necessarily surprising, but I do think it's interesting to see that grant dependency is at its highest in the smallest organisations and lowest in the largest. And in contrast, earned income is at its highest in the biggest organisations and would seem to be harder to achieve in the smaller ones. So if what we're saying is that, okay, it's roughly 1 for 1 when we look at it as a national picture, actually you really need to understand what difference the size of the organisation makes in these business models, because it's quite substantial. And so it's not relevant merely to make a national comparison. You need to make a comparison to people of a similar size. And you wouldn't know that if you only looked at the national summary stats. You've got to break it down to get into that. To take that one step further, when we look at where people, what types of earned income that is, we split this between core, so that is going to be your main artistic activity, related educational things, and other forms of supplementary, which is probably the shop and the cafe. So again, the ratio between them is hugely different between the large and the small. So again, what this is saying is it matters that we have some specificity in those comparison groups, that we do compare to people roughly like you, because this kind of nuance will get lost in the national summaries. So it definitely does matter. And then if I hadn't made that point enough already, here's a third version of it that says, again, if we look at what the contributed income types are, where are different things dominant? So this mid-blue colour here is the trusts. Trusts are a larger proportion of turnover in that sub couple of £1 million a year crowd than they are in the largest organisations. I don't think that's wildly surprising to anybody. I just think it's useful to have it put so kind of starkly. We have 20 minutes to go, and I would like to open this up to discussions. I have, of course, got lots of data in my back pocket. We can do more of it. But how are we doing on the questions discussion? Shall I stop with the slides? I'm going to stop for now.
Maybe if I sort of sneak my questions in first, and I'll see if anybody has any questions they want to sort of build on from that.
Mm-hmm.
You've talked a lot about how important it is to compare to people roughly similar to you. What kind of characteristics would you say are most key to focus on when looking for roughly similar organizations?
Okay, I've touched on a couple of these, but let's make them stark. Looking at this data over many years, a couple of things really stand out. The difference in business models between those organizations who run a public building and those who do not is huge. And if you think about that, that's to do with the people that it takes, to open the doors and switch the lights on. It's the cost of running a public building, whether that's the insurance, whether that's the maintenance, the new roof, etc. It's a totally different cost structure. So that really does make a difference. And this is the one that tends to surprise people, that you have more in common in your business model between organizations from different art forms, but a similar turnover level, than you do between small museums and big museums, or small theatre and big theatre. So there's greater similarity between a 200,000 a year theatre company and a 200,000 a year visual arts organisation than between 200 grand a year theatre and 10 million a year theatre, and that tends to surprise people.
I'm honestly, I
that would be, you would be in that camp.
I would be in that camp when I think about it. I'm like, oh yeah, of course, and whether they've got buildings or not, and what their sort of secondary activities are, is the other thing that I tend to see. My second question is, what are the most common questions that you examine through benchmarking? What sorts of things come up?
One of the core ones is to say, well, we've got limited money to spend on our growth. Mm-hmm. We can only spend it once. What is going to give me my best chance of things? So there's an opportunity cost. I can do A or B or C, but I can't do all of them. How am I going to choose? And I think it's a combination of the kind of analytical, do the maths, where do we think the market potential is, along with what do we think the role, the kind of societal role of culture in the place, or whether that's a community of place, a geographic community, or a community of interest. So it's a combination of those things, but it's the how do I choose between these various options for my future when I can't do all of them.
Mm-hmm. And do you sort of have a structured process to help people start thinking their way through that naughty problem, or is it sort of you kind of look at the data, or how do you go about tackling that sort of thing?
There's 2 or 3 key parts to it. One of them is to say, what are the assets of the organisation? So what is it that you are using, what are you leveraging to generate your year-on-year income? Because if we can understand what your assets are, then we can extend the conversation to say, well, to whom are they of interest? And what are your networks, your relationships, your kind of, what's the key people map that your organisation has? Because do you have the strength of relationships in all the places you might need them going forward? Or are there some gaps? So we ask a set of questions about, what are the other uses of these assets? Where are the strengths and relationships, and who else might you need? And those things, along with a kind of broader vision of who are we, who do we want to be, where are we going, that will feel much more ethereal by comparison to kind of, I'm going to tie it down to building a collection of some scripts, etc. So you want all of those things along with the vision piece of the people in the organization, and you might also include that in that a kind of vision piece of your audiences and what they want from you. So if you start with that set of things, then you have a bunch of elements to play with, and there's the fun of the what directions could we go off in, balanced against the where are the quick wins for things that we know how to do, where the returns may not be enormous, but we've got a good chance of success. So that's the kind of low risk, low return stuff. Balanced against some higher risk, higher return, take longer to get there things that probably feel a little more inspirational, but you can't afford lots of them. And again, your ability to burn cash in places that doesn't generate what you want from it because you haven't done it before. So the freedom to make mistakes without it, without losing your shirt is important in this.
Yes.
So being able to do things in a staged way helps. So there is absolutely a process. And actually, if people were interested in some of that, there's probably a few links that we could come up with where I and others have written about that topic. Yes. We have 10 minutes left. What are my chances of some questions coming from the participants? Pretty please.
Yes.
I have to talk about COVID. Yes. Which bit?
I was thinking what sort of happened in terms of trends have you seen from COVID? Because I think that might be interesting to the audience. Please feel free to interrupt me, audience. You have the chat if you hate this idea. About some of the kind of general trends you've seen happening and how that's affected maybe small versus large, or any kind of, I know buildings have had an impact on that, and maybe a little bit about that aspect.
Okay, so I'm going to take early COVID first. So March last year, when everything shut, there was, a worldwide mad scramble to say, how do we not go under rapidly? And a few things obviously changed very, very quickly. So in March, freelance contracts disappeared. Anything that could be got out of was got out of. Rightly or wrongly, a lot of freelancers were left with nowhere to go very quickly. Trading ceased. So whether that is the core thing of open building, have people come into it, or whether that is cafes and retailing, traditional trading activities largely ceased and did so pretty much overnight. There's some really interesting work about to what extent is that refunded. So a lot of building-based performing arts organisations said, we'd really appreciate it if you would turn that into a donation. We will, of course, give you a refund if you ask for it, but we'd really rather it was a donation because we still have our suppliers to pay. And whilst you haven't had the product, we've incurred the cost. Please help us out. So I think there's some really interesting messaging around how that was done and why that was a reasonable ask. The move towards more digital as the months evolved, I think has been fascinating. There was some very immediate stuff that says, aha, we have some past content that is already designed for broadcast, let us do more of it. So those who had it made use of it. What was interesting, I think, was some of the small organizations. So the agility of some of those smaller entities, the number of comedy festivals, stand-up nights, XYZ that were moved into an online environment to give people some culture, to give them routes of engagement. And some of that was, this is not the kind of classic cultural organization piece, but the YouTube-based pub quiz that took off in lockdown 1 was something of a phenomenon in the UK, but giving people the opportunity to work out how to use digital in a way that, it had been sitting on the back burner for a lot of organisations. I think there's something really interesting in there. A couple of things that have come through the funding that I think have been very challenging. Very few people had the level of reserves that would have been a good idea, but I would say in part because there's been such a push towards trading that people haven't been putting money in the rainy day fund because they felt like they couldn't. Because the expectation is you must grow. You must put everything you've got into more growth and don't stick it in the rainy day fund. And that has come around to bite us on the bum.
Mm-hmm.
So working capital, liquid, money in the bank, that's been tricky. And that's led a number of funders to go from project funding to organisational funding and to make money available to boost reserves that had been depleted. And that's really uncommon. We don't usually see that. Some of the things that I would say haven't worked. So there was an expectation at one point that money would trickle from the organizations to the freelancers. I would suggest that hasn't happened. Because the money's been held in the organization to keep staff employed and to keep paying basic overheads of the building itself. And money has not fed into the freelance population, and that continues to be problematic. And it has quite a lot to tell us, I think, about just, we are also hugely dependent on a freelance workforce in this sector, and yet their visibility is very low indeed, and their voice is even less. So it ain't all roses. No surprise there.
No, sadly. So I will maybe have a final call from questions from the room. You have one of the great experts of the UK on financial benchmarking here. So if you've got any questions you would like to ask, please pop them in.
I think I'd ask, the question I think I'd ask of the audience here is, does this feel relevant? You've studiously sat through it for the last 50 minutes. Does this even seem vaguely relevant? Does it seem like the position in the UK has got anything to teach to Canada? Is there stuff that we ought to learn from you that is happening already? Actually, there's fantastic data in the CADAC data sets that is being really well used. And in fact, the UK could learn from some of that. So why did you come to this session, and was it worth it? The dangerous question. Okay.
Oh, we have from Katie Mitchell. Hugely relevant. I'm doing my PhD in place-based cultural investment and I have 2 jobs. Oh, you poor thing. I know this problem. One for an MPO and one for a city council. It's touching on talking points across all my roles. Wonderful. Hugely important. And Kim Mitchell, based in the UK. Honestly, if you'd like to pop your thoughts into chat, even if you don't have questions, if you'd just like to say how you found it, we'd really appreciate that. It's always great to hear from an audience. And sometimes with these digital events, you do end up feeling a little bit like you're talking to the void. So it's nice to know that you were all here and you were paying attention.
And that it felt relevant because I'm talking to a bunch of black rectangles. And that's disconcerting when you're used to looking at faces and judging reactions that way.
Thank you, Daphne.
What else would you, so if you're walking away from this saying we could do with some of these things, what action might you take as a result of this? Is there anything practical that you can do? Or is it about saying the sector needs these things? Will the people involved in policy please do them? So what change would you like to see?
That's a really good question.
Not always easy to answer on the spot, mind.
No. I think that's a really wise observation, Katie Mitchell. And just in case there's anyone who can't read the chat, there's a sector-wide problem where culture seems to run on a concept of everything is fine and any numbers are good numbers, rather than the idea of measuring and benchmarking. So it's great to hear benchmarking and comparative work championed and encouraged. I was wondering if there's maybe a thought that you'd like to build on, Sarah?
I wonder whether there's also a, I'm not sure we dare look at it because we might not always like what we see. So sometimes we're better off not knowing. We're getting by, so let's not rock the boat. I wonder if there's a degree of that going on, because sometimes you look at this stuff and it's, it doesn't always make easy reading.
No.
Sometimes I wonder if conscious ignorance is a strategy.
At least occasionally, in my experience, you get people who are a little bit scared of data.
Yes, definitely. I'm particularly scared of finance. I think there's quite a fear that says, I'm not sure I understand the numbers. I don't think I could admit to that. And therefore I shall avoid it. So there's definitely fear around financial information, for sure. Quite commonplace. And indeed, in some cases, would go so far as to say I reject it because my job is to create great culture, so stop making me think about the money. 3 minutes, closing thoughts, good point. So my closing thoughts are, this data exists. And I know that it exists in CADAC, so I am confident that it exists in Canada as well as in the UK. Our problem is not a lack of data. Our challenge is in the making it relevant. So how do we harness it to support decision making? It should not be that the data makes the decision. The data is here to make you think, to work out what you're going to do about it. So it's not here as a substitute for ideas and opinions and everything else. It is here to feed into a data-informed decision rather than a computer says no. And there are places that are championing this kind of work, and there are cohorts of organizations, programs, support routes, etc., so that if you want to do more of this, you can go and join them. The one that I'm involved in at the moment in the UK is called Heritage Compass, and is for heritage organizations seeking to grow and change. And that is going to be recruiting again soon. There's other programs of activity run by, whether it's the Audience Agency, Cause for, Institute of Fundraising, Arts Marketing Association. There are a few places around, and there's money for programs from the likes of the lottery. So if you want this, it is available. It might take a little digging to go find it, but there's definitely work around this area. And I think it's, I think it's here to stay. I don't think it's about to disappear. We're not tail end of this. This is just the beginning. So,
shall we take that as our final note to end on?
Yes. So thank you very much for your time. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and goodbye from London.